Order. Good morning and welcome to the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee of the House of Commons. We're delighted to be joined this morning by colleagues from Ofwat. David, very welcome to the committee. Can I invite you, just for the benefit of the official record, to introduce yourself and your colleagues?
David Black, Chief Executive at Ofwat. Helen?
I'm Helen Campbell. I'm the Senior Director at Ofwat.
Good morning, I'm Chris Walters and I'm the Senior Director for PR24 at Ofwat.
Good morning, you are very welcome. We want to start this morning with some questions around the economic regulation of the sector, something that's been the subject of some considerable political comment and controversy. David, we appreciate that Ofwat is a creature of statute, that you have your remit and your objectives set by government, but looking at where it has brought us, regulation of the sector has failed, hasn't it?
No, I wouldn't agree. I think it does show the case for the need for strong regulation of the sector, and it does show the need for the actions that we have taken as a regulator in recent years to turn around performance of the sector. It's very clear the sector needs to change, and certainly the issues around public anger over storm overflows, sewage discharges, concerns about companies' corporate behaviours very clearly signal the need for change. That said, it's important to keep in mind that the sector has raised over £240 billion of new investment since privatisation. There has been significant reductions in leakage to the lowest ever level, so 40% reduction over the last 30 years, and there's more to do. And so areas that we're focused on is improving and playing a role in providing strategic leadership for the sector. We're going to back a record level of investment to turn around performance, and we're working to change the culture in the sector to one that owns responsibility and to drive up performance for customers and the environment.
So regulation has been so successful, we need to have all these changes.
We're very clear that there's a need for change, but it's our role as a regulator to help drive that change and protect the interests of customers and the environment. But clearly the issues that we see do require changes across the board, and that's what we're doing.
Can I just take you back to the objectives set out in the 91 Act? Your objectives, as amended, are to protect the interests of consumers. Do you feel that that's been a success?
So in terms of, if we look at, for example, customer bills since privatisation, they've increased, but we have saved customers money in terms of billions of pounds at each price review by driving value for customers. We've also seen improvements in service. As I've talked about, leakage has been reduced by over 40% since privatisation, and that's on the back of around £240 billion of new investment. That's seen, for example, the replacement and relining of 40% of water mains since over the last 30 years. So while it's very clear there are some things that need to change, we can point to real successes in the model since privatisation.
Ensuring that water companies are financially able to carry out their statutory functions and that these functions are properly carried out. I mean, is that a fair description of, for example, Thames Water at the moment?
So Thames Water very clearly have issues with their financial structures, and what we've taken action to ensure that customers don't bear the consequences. At privatisation, it was always expected that we might see companies fail. That's why the special administration regime was created. It wasn't Ofwat's role to stop companies going bust. It is our role to ensure that customers' interests are protected when companies' finances when they are unable to meet their obligations. But the point is that the sector has raised finance. They've raised, as I say, around £100 billion of finance since privatisation, and they've used that to finance around £240 billion of investment. Then
to check that water companies abide by the terms of their licence, that's maybe a more direct process point. And then to encourage the water industry to take steps to secure the long-term resilience of water supply and wastewater systems. Compared to where we were in 1991, success or failure?
So the resilience duty was a new duty added to us since 2014. I think it has changed the way that we've looked at the sector, and in particular the focus we've put on securing new water resources. And so in the last price review in 2019, we set aside around £500 million of funding for companies to investigate and develop new water resources. And I'm pleased to say at this price review we have over 18 schemes worth over £25 billion coming forward. These are major new reservoirs, major new water recycling schemes, major water transfer schemes. These will require planning consents, and that has been a challenge for the sector in the past. So, for example, major reservoir in Oxfordshire was denied planning permission in 2012, but we're confident that the sector does have a set of options now that does allow the challenges of climate change to be addressed.
We've seen this development in the models of ownership of water companies over the years. That's been an evolutionary process, but it has moved quite far. We've gone from low-risk, low-yield models to something that has returned rather more significantly higher yields. How has that impacted the industry, do you think?
Yeah, so we've seen, companies at privatisation were listed, and so we've seen a move for most companies to move into either private equity models, or in Wales we have a not-for-dividend company model. We do see variations in performance. We think there are particular challenges with the private equity model where there are consortiums of private equity owners, but it's not the case that all private equity firms have performed poorly by any means, but we do think there are some benefits in the listed model. But we regulate to try to secure the best outcomes from each model. I think one of the things that we've changed since perhaps we were established is to put much more weight on company performance for customers and the environment in terms of driving their returns. So at privatisation, there was relatively few incentives in place for companies to improve service. At this coming price review, we'll have a much sharper focus on environmental performance, and I think that was one of the things that Ofwat needed to change, was to basically align the returns of investors with performance for customers and the environment, and that's the steps that we're taking now. Mm-hmm. I do think there are certainly lessons to be learned from the levels of debt that some of the companies have taken on. So, as I said, at privatisation we weren't established to stop companies going bust, but we do think that more preventive action would improve outcomes. And we've now got new powers to do just that. So,
and obviously it would have predated your tenure, but why did that preventive action not happen?
Yeah, so all regulators, so in terms of in the sort of early to mid-2000s, there was the development of the use of high gearing structures, and in energy, water, aviation, and all regulators took the approach of putting in additional protections in place in terms of requirements for companies to obtain investment-grade credit ratings, but they didn't take more active steps than that. I think that wasn't, I don't think that model's been successful. I think we should have had tighter controls, and that's why we have changed the regime since we've got new powers to do so in 2020.
And some of these credit ratings now are through the floor, aren't they?
Yes, and so in a sense the model does work, but it takes a long time. I think rating agencies have been quite slow to downgrade companies, and that comes back to the issue that maybe that protection applies too late. So effectively the regime stops investors taking money out once they lose good quality.
So as a regulator, what other performance indicators should you be looking at then?
So we think some of the basic ones around customer service, so customer satisfaction, things like leakage, as well as on the environment side, pollution incidents, and we've now got good data on storm overflows, sewage discharges, so that should be part of it as well. Sewer flooding in homes is a really distressing issue for customers, so that's a key measure for us as well. And then obviously the compliance with regulatory obligations.
And what are these performance indicators telling you at the moment? Customer satisfaction? The
customer satisfaction is not good. So when we compare water sector with other utility sectors, it looks quite similar, but all utilities tend to rate towards the bottom end of customer rankings. And I think what concerns me most is we don't have a water company that's in the top quartile of customer satisfaction. We've got some better performance, but overall we don't see enough good performers in the sector, and the worst performers tend to be at the bottom of national league tables along with other utilities and transport providers.
Mm-hmm. So, what powers then do you effectively have to change this, to turn this round? Licences, price review process, what else have you got?
So the key tools we have are the price review and the company licences. That's the rules we set around company compliance. And as I said, since 2021, we now have much stronger powers to change company licences. So we went for a period, 30 years, where we didn't have a good powers to change company licences. I think that was a key weakness in the regulatory regime that's now been remedied. We think in terms of future questions, there are questions around investment planning. So at the moment, most of that sits with the Environment Agency in England and Natural Resources Wales and Wales. So we think the question about have we got the quantum of environmental investment right is clearly in sharp relief given the issues that we're seeing in the sector. And we think that planning process hasn't delivered the kind of outcomes that are kept pace with climate change. We're also looking at new powers in terms of board governance and oversight. And the government obviously has the water bill before the House, which would give us new powers in regard to executive pay. We also think there are some powers which are perhaps more technical around enabling more competitive procurement of infrastructure. So you may be familiar with the Thames Tideway model, so the £4.6 billion new super sewer going under London, which will reduce sewage discharges by up to 95% in the tidal Thames. But that model is the first project of its kind, and we would like to see it used more frequently across the sector. It's possible to do so, but the legislation is constrained on that, so we think that should change. We also think our enforcement powers, in terms of our powers to require companies to provide redress on issues, are quite limited and need to be modernised as well.
It's quite a crowded landscape in terms of regulation, isn't it?
Yes.
Is that helpful? Could it be streamlined?
So I think there's a question for the government in terms of how the different regulators and how the regulatory models work. But we think the most important thing is for us to make the most of the powers that we have. And so, for example, we've established RAPID, which is our regulatory alliance with the Environment Agency and the DWI, Drinking Water Inspectorate, to bring forward major new projects, and we're seeing real success with that model. So we are seeing, as I say, 21 new projects coming forward.
Finally from me, before we move on, you've got this new growth duty. That gives you fairly broad priorities. What are you doing to make sure that this range of duties under your growth duty is achievable?
Yes, so one of the key areas is around investment to support growth, so particularly growth in new housing, growth in new business sites. And so we're looking at that as part of the 2024 price review. We'll look at how we can take action to make sure that companies are investing to anticipate and meet growth demands. It's also very clear that in places wastewater infrastructure is a potential constraint to growth. So again, making sure that is addressed. And then there's a question about whether companies are complying with their duties in terms of making sure that they are doing all that they can to address issues which might arise from growth and new development. So we are looking, we've reviewed that new duty that we have and how we can implement it. We will consult on that as well.
Charlie.
Thank you. I'd just like to explore that sort of complex regulatory environment a little bit more. And how would you assess the sort of current effectiveness of your working relationship with those other regulators like the Environment Agency, Drinking Water Inspectorate or Natural Resources Wales?
Yeah, so I think we work closely with them. I meet frequently with the Chief Executives of the Environment Agency and the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So we've established a RAPID, this bespoke operation we've got on new water infrastructure. In the area of wastewater, we think it's more complex, and that's where we have been working hard with the Environment Agency in England and Natural Resources Wales and Wales. And so, for example, the key investment driver for the wastewater investment is the Water Industry National Environment Programme. And so we've been looking at how we can work with the Environment Agency to reform that so we get the kind of outcomes that people expect from the water sector.
If you had a blank piece of paper, you were to start this all over again, what would you change in terms of either the regulators, the regulatory environment, or the legislation under which you're working?
So I think there's questions about the allocation of responsibilities between the Environment Agency and Ofwat and making sure that's clear. So, for example, the Environment Agency set permits on wastewater treatment works. I think that's absolutely right that they do that, and that aligns with their duties elsewhere with industry and farmers. I think it's really important then that the regulatory regime that we operate encourages companies to comply and to go well beyond what the Environment Agency do. And so I think the challenge with any regulatory regime is to get the best out of the arrangements that are there. There's a question in terms of how the government wants to allocate responsibilities, which is no doubt will investigate with the review by Sir John Cunliffe. And we'll wait, there's a question for government in that space. But we think in terms of working closely with the Environment Agency, making sure there's effective information sharing with them, between them and us, and then making sure that we're using our enforcement powers in a way that reinforces the activities of each other.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and interesting sort of subject area, and the Environment Agency's relationship with other agencies in the space as well is something no doubt we'll be exploring in due course. The structure of the water companies themselves are complex. Does that hinder your work as the regulator? Would there be a better way forward in terms of how those companies are set up?
So in terms of how the companies are set up themselves, there is, so all companies, so we have what we call a regulated company structure. So there's a license which sets out the requirements for companies. We think it's really important that they're transparent. And we've put quite a lot of weight in terms of making sure that the requirements we have on companies to be transparent about their finances and explain them are there. We think companies have more to do in that space. But we do think some of the corporate structures, companies have traditionally used were not helpful. So things like Cayman Island structures, which were, I think, developed for issuing bonds rather than for tax purposes, but nonetheless have certainly not helped the sector, and that's why we've been pleased to see companies take action to address these issues.
Can I just add something to that? Excuse me. So I think it's right to look at structures for companies, but also Ofwat has done a lot of work on the governance of companies and making sure that there is good balance in boards so that it isn't solely represented by investor neds, for example. So we have introduced standards and principles around good governance, and we're looking at refreshing those as well in light of latest developments on good corporate governance.
Thank you. And just lastly, for now on this, I mean, in terms of the Water Industry National Environment Programme, and you say you want to make that more transparent, can you just go a little bit further into that? How do you intend to make that happen, and what do you want to see?
So that obviously is led by the Environment Agency, but we think it is, it's a huge environmental investment programme. So at this price review, we're talking about over £20 billion of investment, and that will touch every community across England and Wales. So we would like to see that to be fully transparent, open consultation process on that. We'd like to see participation by environmental groups in terms of the design and the delivery of that programme. We'll be encouraging companies to be very clear about the schemes that are in that programme, so there are around 17,000 individual schemes, and to engage with their communities as they deliver on this programme over the next 5 years.
Thank you. Henry, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I was just following on from this point around it being a crowded space in terms of from a regulatory point of view. And I was wondering whether you thought there was a democratic deficit and lack of accountability, particularly with Ofwat. We've had huge amount of anger from the public. You're here today, but I wondered what your thoughts were about that democratic deficit in respect to that regulation space.
Yeah, so we think it's really important that as a regulator that we engage as well, and so as part of this price review, Chris can talk more about that, but we've engaged, we've held public meetings in terms of on our draft determination decisions. We had over 700 customers attend those meetings and a broad range of opinions. We had an independent chair to make sure that customer voices were heard. We think it is a real challenge in terms of, but it is one of the opportunities that we actually have as a sector, curiously, as you've said, because the public is very much more engaged on these issues than they were, say, 5 years ago, much more so than they were a decade ago. So we do require companies to engage with customers as well. We think it's absolutely right that customers are at the centre of the decision making for the sector. I think there's been a big challenge in the environmental space to make sure voices are heard in that space, and that we look forward to working with the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales on that as well.
Can I just add, from a price review perspective, our job is to scrutinise proposals that are made to us to ensure that they're good value for money, and then to hold companies to account for those proposals. But we don't get to say what's in those proposals. That's the job of our sister regulators, the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, the Drinking Water Inspectorates in the UK and Welsh governments. It's important to us to engage with people so that they can see what our process of scrutiny is delivering, but a lot of what we're talking about is in the gift of others.
Is that a system that you think works well?
I think the system was set up to generate creative tension between its constituent parts. As you've already set out, I think Views differ as to how well that creative tension has worked in the past. But to my mind, a system that has more collaboration built into it is more important for the future.
Sarah, you wanted a quick point and then moving on.
Yes, if I could. There's 27 former directors, managers and consultants who are now working in the water industry, creating a potential concern around conflict of interest. Do you share that?
No, we are very rigorous in terms of how we manage conflicts of interest. Any staff that leave Ofwat, we generally have a set of requirements around what they can do and what they can't do that applies for up to 2 years that they leave. A lot of these people you're talking about have left Ofwat some years earlier, worked in other sectors, other employers, and then gone to work for water companies. So it's not the case that people have left Ofwat and gone directly to water companies. In many of these cases that have been referred to, we think it's really important actually that we ourselves access people from water companies, but our decisions are made by our board and our senior executives. And we're absolutely rigorous in terms of how conflicts of interest are managed. Most people that leave Ofwat go to work in other sectors or other regulators or other parts of government. Obviously, we have about 40 to 50 people leave Ofwat, I'd say, per year. If one or two of those go to water companies, I don't think that stops us being an effective regulator.
You want to move on, Sarah? You good to take the next section?
No, I'm the number 3 actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
okay. Sorry. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Fine. My apologies. You mentioned that you've the customer satisfaction is low, and there are enforcement issues around that. Why have the regulators failed to address weak performance?
In terms of customer service, we set financial incentives on companies to improve service, and we've tried to strengthen those incentives. We've tried to make sure that we're capturing accurately customer satisfaction, bearing in mind that many customers actually, the main contact they have with the water company is receiving a bill, paying a bill, rather than dealing with a service issue. But where they do have an issue, it's usually really important for customers to have that issue addressed. If that's an issue with the water not being supplied or sewage, then it's really important to have that sorted out. We think that the regime in terms of around complaints hasn't been that effective, and so we've introduced a new licence condition, again, referring to those new powers that we received in 2021. The second licence change that we made, the first was around financial resilience, the second was around introducing new standards around customer service. And so we'll use that to make sure that even if companies are addressing customer service in a general sense on a satisfactory basis, if they fail to supply or address issues that customers raise, then it gives us new powers to take enforcement action against companies which do not improve, and we'll use those powers.
So, kind of moving on to kind of pollution incidents being at an unacceptable level, does Ofwat and the Environment Agency need to work closer together to ensure companies take these incidents seriously enough to tackle them?
Yeah, so I think that is an area of poor performance, and so let's be clear, there are some areas which companies have made substantial improvements since privatisation. On pollution incidents, they did so up until about 10 years ago, but since then the record has been poor. It's either been stagnant or increasing in recent years. We think that must change. And so to drive that change, we're going to strengthen the incentives companies have. So every time there's a pollution incident, there's an automatic penalty on them. We're introducing a new measure in the next price review on serious pollution incidents. So these are the ones that cause harm to the environment, and so they'll attract additional attention. And then for us, there's a question about, coming back to the point that the Chair raised earlier, about the operation of companies. And perhaps I could ask Helen to talk a bit more about the work we're doing across the board to drive that company performance, but often that's about their environmental performance.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd say that in addition to some of these hard measures in our licence and the fines and enforcement approach, one of the key tools that we have is working with our fellow regulators, to your point about the EA, to monitor and oversee where companies are performing, and to lean in much more and challenge companies where we see performance falling short. So we publish an annual performance report, the Water Company Performance Report, which was published in the autumn. And in that sets out where companies are performing against the 12 common performance commitments that they committed to in PR19. For those companies that are in the bottom of the category against expectations, although I accept that pollution incidents, the whole sector was in a poor state. But against those categories, we hold the companies at the bottom to account. They come and meet Ofwat, and we invite our fellow regulators, and we ask those companies to set out commitments and service commitment plans that are transparent on websites for customers and stakeholders to see, to explain how they're getting performance back on track. And we meet them quarterly to assess their progress. So your point about working with other regulators is really important to us, and there's real strength in having the quality regulators alongside Ofwat in this kind of forum.
And do you think that the use of self-reporting by water companies undermines the robustness of the data that you're getting back in?
I think it's clear that having measurable undeniable data is really important. So there is now monitoring on all storm overflows across England and Wales, and that's been in place since 2021. So that gives undeniable evidence that how storm overflows are operating that we can act on as regulators. I think there are elements within all regulatory regimes where there is a degree of self-reporting, but that does need to be followed up with a checking regime, and that is certainly the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales and the Drinking Water Inspectorate have regimes of checking with companies in terms of the commitments that they've made.
And we welcome the new regime of inspections that the Environment Agency is going to roll out, so with the additional funding that they've secured from the government.
Yeah. And how are you looking to improve the transparency of the data that's provided by water companies, given that Thames Water has recently been fined £3.3 million after a deliberate attempt to mislead the Environment Agency?
Yeah, so generally we think there's real power in open data, so the ability to make transparent company performance across the piece. I think we've seen with sewage discharge, storm overflows, actually just what a great force for change there's been from making that data public. We think there's more data within companies that should be shared, and that's why we're pursuing an agenda of open data with the sector. In terms of misreporting, so where companies deliberately misreport information, we take that very seriously indeed. And when we find instances of that, we impose very large penalties. So, for example, Southern Water in 2019, we imposed penalties of around £127 million, and that was essentially, from our perspective, a misreporting case, a very serious one in terms of their reporting on pollution incidents. A more recent case with Cymru Welsh Water was around misreporting on leakage, and that wasn't a deliberate attempt to conceal their performance. Nonetheless, the data was an error. We uncovered that in terms of our robustness check on the data submitted by the company. The company has put that right, and so we will take action. We're very clear to companies that we set high standards in this space. If they fail, there are severe consequences.
Just before I come to Henry, by which means did the misreporting at Thames and Southern come to light?
So the misreporting at Southern Water was uncovered by the Environment Agency, I believe, and I'm not exactly sure that Thames instance you're referring to. I believe it was an environmental issue that you're referring to, so that would have been the Environment Agency.
Okay. Henry?
I wanted to ask, you've talked about greater oversight in terms of performance. I was wondering about those investment cycles. I think you've got a 5-year investment cycle. I was wondering whether there was a case to be made for a longer-term investment cycle that would enable a longer-term view from the individual water companies.
Right, yeah. Pick that up. So yes, we want a long-term sector, and we've put a lot of focus on the sector taking a long-term approach. And at this 2024 price review, we required all companies to prepare their business plans in the context of a 25-year long-term delivery strategy. We've looked at the length of the price review repeatedly since we were established as a regulator. We haven't seen a strong case to extend that. We've looked at what Ofgem, so Ofgem moved from a 5-year to an 8-year price review. They've moved back to a 5-year price review. I think the answer is not in the length of the price review. The answer is making sure that each price review builds towards a longer-term outcome. And so we do welcome, and I think the sector's actually lacked long-term goals. I think that's changing. So the government set a number of long-term goals. We've now, for example, got a goal to drive down leakage by 50% by 2050. So having those goals in place, then using the 5-year price review as a check and challenge. And to come back to, what's the disadvantages of a longer-term price review? Well, it does lock you in. So, for example, on storm overflows, we're introducing a whole raft of new measures and new investments in 2025. If the price review period had been 8 to 10 years, we would have been waiting another 3 to 5 years to do that. In the last price review period, we've had COVID, we've had war in Ukraine, we've had high inflation. So it is important that we do update the settings. So there's a balance to be struck. The important thing is that other companies in other sectors don't have the luxury of a 5-year forward look. We think it should be useful for companies, but it's no excuse for a company to only look ahead 5 years. It's a long-term sector. We need to be looking ahead 25 years, 50 years, 80 years into the future to anticipate the challenges that are going to come. And we're seeing a number of investments come forward at this latest price review, which will be started but not completed actually in the 5-year period. So I'm confident that we've got the regime that can run investments that span over a longer period of time, and that the proof of that is in the investments we're seeing coming forward in the 2024 price review.
Helen.
Thank you, Chair. The Chair touched on some of the failings that have come out relating to Thames Water and Southern Water and how those have come to be exposed. I think it would be fair to say that a lot of the failings in the water industry have actually only been exposed because of the work of campaign groups and volunteers in our communities and our constituencies who have gone out, tested water supplies, exposed what's been happening. Groups like Surfers Against Sewage, in my own constituency, the Clean Water Action Group, many of them have paid out of their own pocket to test water supplies. How do you make sure that you're including the voice of those campaign groups in the work that you do?
Firstly, I think they have done a great job on highlighting issues, and this is the point about open data we think can at least help those groups look at what companies are doing, look at the data that's available, and then test and challenge if they think something different is happening. So we work quite hard to take account of their views. They obviously submit views to us as part of, say, the price review process. We engage with environmental groups. We meet with them and hear their views. They're a vital source of information and challenge. Chris, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about that.
There's probably two things I would add to that. Thanks, David. Thank you for the question. The first would be Ofwat's Innovation Fund, which is a £200 million fund, which is now doubled to £400 million, which funds a lot of joint working between the regulators, government and environmental campaign groups, and in particular in one area around mainstreaming so-called nature-based solutions using green solutions instead of grey solutions. So we as an organisation sit on the board of that and regularly talk to the environmental campaign groups on that. And I suppose in the other area would be the representations we've had back from environmental campaign groups in response to our draft determinations back in July. We received many hundreds of representations overall, of course from companies and of course from investors and of course from customer groups, but also many from environmental NGOs, and you will see those reflected in changes that we're making for our final decisions, which we'll publish on the 19th of December, which will have the biggest step change in environmental investment firstly, and we'll also have new performance commitments for important environmental issues such as improving biodiversity and reducing operational greenhouse gases.
As part of the process you're undergoing at the moment around the price review, you obviously take submissions from those groups, but how regularly do you meet with those environmental campaigners, David?
Yeah, we meet regularly with them, and Chris has met regularly. We do meet regularly with them, yes. So, yeah.
I now want to turn to another section around interruptions to water supplies and water outages, which Ofwat regulates. For those, the public that may not understand the terminology here, that's when the taps stop working, the taps to your house run dry. Of the 17 water companies that Ofwat regulate, how many are meeting their targets with regards to that?
Don't put Helen on the spot, but I think maybe 3 to 4 in the latest years. So we've set a very challenging target in terms of bearing down on supply interruptions, because we do appreciate this is difficult for customers to face. So there's an automatic penalty regime runs on when water is not supplied to customers for more than 3 hours. And so we record company performance against that and penalise companies. We have seen this improve quite significantly since privatisation. So the number of water supply interruptions have been reduced by by a very significant margin. What we do see is 2 or 3 companies in particular which have had very poor performance in this space, and so it's those companies that we're targeting in terms of further needing to address and improve on these issues. We have seen the rest of the sector actually improve its robustness. So, for example, I can go back to a freeze-thaw incident we had in 2017 when a number of 4 companies in particular performed poorly. The challenge in a freeze-thaw, when you have a rapid thaw as the pipes expand and mains burst. And the same incident happened 2 to 3 years later, and we saw 3 out of the 4 of those companies significantly improve the way they handle those issues. So there's probably 2 or 3 dimensions. One is in terms of preventing these incidents from happening by making sure systems are resilient, and then the other is being able to react and respond when these incidents occur. Because one of the criticisms we've got for companies is, in some of these incidents, I think you may refer to, is that companies have not handled the incidents itself.
We will come on to that, but the answer is 4. So 4 out of 17 companies are actually meeting their basic
I'd have to
targets
confirm
on water supply interruptions.
Data.
It has a huge impact on people in our communities when this happens. You can imagine the impact on going about your daily life, using the toilet, cooking food, but then also the impact on businesses and communities when this happens. There have been 2 major incidents in my community, one in Rye and the surrounding area that affected people for 8 days in October 2023, and then one this year in Hastings and St Leonards that affected 30,000 people. For 5 days they had no water, and it had a massive impact. As you have touched upon, Southern Water completely failed to meet their basic obligations during that period. They promised bottled water deliveries to the vulnerable that did not come. They promised water stations. There weren't enough. We had traffic gridlock in the town, and businesses had to close and had a huge impact on businesses. So there's 2 parts that I want to ask you about. First, I want to ask you about the compensation when these incidents happen. So this is something Ofwat regulate. You have the standards of service that dictate what should happen when you have a water interruption, and that is very clear that when a customer's water is interrupted, they should be compensated. In this incident, the most recent one in May 2024, Southern Water have said that the Ofwat standards of service do not apply and that my constituents will be given no compensation. And more than that, they have said that we have got to pay our water bill for the 5 days when we had no water. So what is the point in having the Ofwat standards of service if they're not actually upheld when you have no water for 5 days?
Yeah, so first I should clarify that the guaranteed service standard is set by the government, not Ofwat, and they set the terms of those. They are being reformed at the moment by the government. We fully support that. And so the difficult issue is that the way the standards are currently drafted is they do allow companies an exemption for extreme events. And we think companies use this to avoid a responsibility. We think that's wrong. We think the rules should be changed, but it's not our responsibility. Unfortunately, we're not given the power to change that. So
who decides whether it's a once-in-a-lifetime event or not?
So if we get a complaint, we can adjudicate on that complaint, but we have to follow the rules that are set by DEFRA. And so the problem we've got is that we had an incident earlier with South East Water where a complaint was referred to us. We had to find in favour of the company because that was consistent with the rules, but we would urge all companies to voluntarily compensate customers in that particular instance like that.
So I'm pleased to hear you can look at it where there's a complaint, because the leader of my council wrote to you in August regarding this incident and the lack of compensation. So I think we would be grateful if you could look into that incident. We haven't yet had a reply on that matter because residents have not been compensated. They've actually had to pay their bills for those days, and it's had a big impact on businesses.
Yeah. The point I would make is I think the regime needs to be changed to make sure that compensation is automatically provided. It's not at present, but if we get a complaint, we can adjudicate on that. But as I say, I do regret to say that I don't think the rules are sufficiently clear about company responsibility. More generally, we would expect companies to compensate customers where they're off supply, regardless of whether or not there's an extreme weather incident or there's some other particular.
Yep. And then looking at the wider system issues around water interruptions, how are you working to make sure that we don't have incidences like this happening again? If I take the most recent incident of which I have the most experience, that was due to a pipe that had been identified by Southern Water for repair in 2007. They actually identified it needed replacing, they sought the planning permission to do it, and then they never did it. and then we had the incident that we did. So how is Ofwat actually acting? If it's not done for the last 17 years, what's changing now to make sure those pipes are repaired and we don't have instances like this?
I think it is really important companies improve the resilience of their networks. That particular incident we have investigated, and Helen can talk more about the work we've done with the company in that space. Generally, as I say, what we do is we set automatic penalties on companies so that when they fail to supply customers, those penalties kick in, and that impacts on companies financially. We'll also look at enforcement powers. So another instance where South East Water has repeatedly interrupted customers, we have live enforcement action against that company to assess whether they're complying with their duty to supply customers with water. And thirdly, in terms of areas of asset management, we are putting much sharper focus on that in terms of the standards that we hold companies to. We'd expect companies to be putting investment proposals to us to improve the resilience of their water supplies. I think Southern do have major investment proposals in front of us as part of this price review. But it is part of the company's licence obligations to maintain their infrastructure. So if they don't do that adequately, we do have the ability to take enforcement action.
Yeah. Could I just add to that the current rate of replacement of water mains in the sector is about 0.1% a year, which means you replace the entire network once every 1,000 years, which is self-evidently not fast enough. We think a more sustainable rate of replacement of water mains will be somewhere around 0.8 to 1.1% a year, which reflects the average asset life of 100 to 125 years. So what we're doing in the current price review is providing funding to quadruple the rate of mains replacement from 0.1% a year to 0.4% a year in this 5-year period, and then we will do the same in the next 5-year period, and Southern Water will benefit from that increase in investment.
You're right to say that it's very important we prevent incidences like this, because in that incident, for example, the Southern Water boss has said they came this close to calling in the military. So we could have very serious incidences on our hands if we don't look at this more closely. You are looking into South East Water in relation to interruptions. Why are you not looking into Southern Water?
So we haven't yet opened an enforcement action against Southern Water. We would have to take the view as to whether or not we think they're in breach of their legal obligations, and so that's something that we would have to assess.
That's something people could refer to you?
Yes.
Okay. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I have been in a similar position to Helen with South West Water. So I represent Truro and Falmouth, and we've had outages for days in the hospital as well, where people have struggled to get water, and now they are trying to get compensation, but they've been told there's limited compensation and they're struggling to get it. So I would echo what she's asked for the fact that these schemes can actually be changed and amended so people can get what they need to get. I was going to move on a bit to water security and resilience. And I read just now that there are 4 billion extra litres needed by 2050, which is an absolutely staggering amount and will be a real pressure on a system that has already been struggling so much for so many years and been underinvested in. So I suppose one of my questions would be, South West Water, as well as the outages, has struggled with leakage, and the leakage data has been shown to be not correct. So I wondered what checks Ofwat are doing to make sure that leakage data is robust and will be more robust in the future.
Yes, measuring leakage is a challenge in the sense you're measuring something that by definition isn't automatically triggered, like I say, a storm overflow monitor. So every year companies submit their data to us. We have a number of inbuilt checks into that process to detect where we think companies are not accurately are reporting that data. As discussed earlier with incidents with Welsh Water, we were able to spot that the data raised some questions. We followed up with the company, and that has uncovered issues. We are talking to South West Water about the data. If we do find evidence that they haven't been reporting accurately, we will take action. But we're not in that position at this point. I think more generally, we're trying to drive, as I say, leakage down. We're talking about a 50% reduction by 2050. Companies have made significant reductions in the past.
How far have we got? Because I understand there's quite a long way to go in the last year of the current.
Yes, so companies will set a challenge to reduce leakage by around 16% in the current price review period. Some companies are on track to do that. Many of them are not. They will face challenges to get there. We will also set them challenging targets to reduce leakage in the next price review period.
What I read earlier was that there was still 30% of the way to go in the last year, so they do seem to be struggling to actually cope with that, don't they? They don't seem to be managing to keep up with this level of requirement. So how do you think they'll cope in the future? At each price review period, as part of the water resource management planning process, companies set out their proposed plans to reduce leakage and to reduce demand, as well as to build new infrastructure. And so as part of that, there's an agreement, if you like, about the measures they're going to take to reduce leakage, and that gets built into the price review and funded as part of the company's business plan. So we do think reducing leakage is a challenge. We do think there's quite a lot of opportunities there for companies, because we're going to roll out 10 million smart meters over the next 5 years in water. So that will give much better data on what's going on across the network. That will allow companies to target issues, to spot issues happening much earlier. In order to reduce leakage, you've got to spot the leaks happening sooner and take action faster. Both of those are vastly enabled by smart metering programs. And as Chris said, we are stepping up the replacement of pipes as well. And so between those two interventions, we do think there's significant scope for companies to drive much harder on leakage. The sector is very clear about its ambitions in the space. They know they need to do better, and we'll continue to challenge companies to address those issues. The other question, of course, is water demand, which is frustrating. When you're getting leakage, it seems harsh to put the onus on consumers. I think all companies now have targets for reducing consumption as well. Does the water sector have a general plan for this? I mean, where I am in Southern Water, there have been seasonal tariffs, mandatory seasonal tariffs, which have gone down quite badly with some consumers, and they do seem to be impacting what they pay. So is that a good idea, or are there better ways of doing this?
I think driving down demand is a huge challenge for the sector. It's one that we've set targets for the current price review period, and generally the sector is not on track to do that. Some of that was a COVID impact, but we think some of it does underline the scale of the challenge. We don't think the sector has worked sufficiently hard at this. We're establishing a new water efficiency fund in the next price review period, so a £100 million fund to help drive a behavioural change. I said smart metering, we think, is part of the solution as well. And then we're open to companies to trialling tariff innovation, which is to try to link what customers pay to the water that they use. It remains to be seen as to whether these trials are successful. It's a challenging space to...
They've been quite controversial, haven't they? Because people have been put on them.
Yes.
And they don't seem to kind of... And had their tariff changed kind of almost without their agreement, really. So do you think that is are these mandatory, because we've been told these tariff changes, the water companies have been told to do them, they have to do them. Is that the case, or is there leeway?
These are trials undertaken by water companies, so they're a choice made by an individual water company to trial a different type of tariff, usually in an area, to see whether or not it will work. Because we all hope that these trials will find a successful way to set bills for customers in a way that will drive demand down, but we don't know until the trials have been complete.
And just one last question, I suppose, looking back at that 4 billion litre figure, which is huge, water security and resilience will be such a big thing in the future. How will the sector build to cope with that?
Yeah, so that 4 billion is driven by both the need to reduce abstraction. So Affinity Water, for example, one of the companies in the southeast, is going to reduce the water abstraction from chalk streams by 1/3 over the next 25 years. It's driven by the need to cater for population growth, and it's driven by the need to build resilience to adapt to climate change. As I said, one of the, I think, success stories we've had in the sector is we have established this rapid group with the Environment Agency and the Drinking Water Inspectorate. We now have 18 major projects coming forward, which gives us the ability to address these challenges in the future. So we've got 3 very large reservoirs coming forward. We've got major water transfer schemes. We've got water recycling schemes. But these will have a big impact. They're also schemes that will attract controversy, and so we think there'll be a challenge in getting them built, but we think it's vital that new infrastructure is built to provide for the future, because I completely agree that even though we're adequately catering to water demand and supply at present, we need to take action. Otherwise, the sector will face very serious challenges in the years to come. The droughts will come. We will see more impacts of climate change. We need to change the way the water system works. We need it more interconnected. We need more resources, and we need networks that can deliver this resource to customers.
Cornwall had a pretty much permanent hosepipe ban last year, so the sector's struggling at the moment, so the future's...
So I think the case of Cornwall does illustrate the importance of the need to get more water resources. And so it is interesting, the company is in the process of trying to build a desalination plant to address that issue and has been blocked from doing so. So that's one of the challenges that companies face.
Reservoirs or desalination plant. Sorry, I've finished now.
Desalination plant in the west of England. Josh.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. I'd like to come back briefly, if I may, to the point of support for vulnerable consumers, which Helen had touched on. I had an incident recently in my constituency, less extreme than some of the other examples we've had, but several thousand customers were affected by a burst water main. And one of the things that concerned me the most in that incident was I had reports from consumers who are on the Priority Services Register but didn't have any water delivered, despite that being promised by South Staff's Water. So what are you doing to monitor companies' performance around supporting those vulnerable consumers? And are you seeing any worrying trends like that perhaps the support isn't there when it ought to be?
Yes, so there are a number of incidents, and as you say, it's really important that companies act speedily in terms of providing water to those who need it. In terms of the priority services registers themselves, I think that is an area where there's been some success as a sector, so we're seeing a significant increase in the number of customers on priority service registers. So I think going back 3 or 4 years ago, there just wasn't the adequate data on priority service registers for them to work. I think we're getting to a place now where we're getting much higher levels of penetration. Then there is a question, do companies deliver in an incident? So that is overseen both by the Drinking Water Inspectorate and ourselves, and DEF also have a role when there's an emergency in terms of making sure that companies comply with their obligations. If we get complaints, we will investigate and we can take action.
I think sometimes, if I may, Chair, briefly, it's a matter of proactive communication as well. So I'm on the Priority Services Register because we have a two-month-old baby. And I'm also a Member of Parliament, and I didn't have any proactive contact from the water company in that instance. So I think it's not just a case of acting on complaints, it's also trying to encourage and require water companies to be more proactive with that approach when things like this happen.
Yes, no, I agree, and we do work also across sectors. So we recently held an event with Ofgem in terms of a vulnerability summit. We got all the chief executives of the water sector there. And particularly we work through some of the issues in terms of how the sector can do better to address the issues of vulnerable customers. Everyone depends on water. It is self-evident that there will be customers who really need the service, and there will inevitably be from time to time interruptions. So it's really important that companies are able to respond to that, and we'll do what we can to make sure companies deliver on that as they should.
You've had another question provoked.
Yeah, just on that point. The way it has worked when we've had these situations is that there will be a few select water stations opened. Traffic descends on those, causing massive gridlock. It happened in both incidences in my patch, and I know it's happened in other places, which then causes wider implications. And then vans go round delivering bottles of water to what they regard as the priority people. Often that will lead to a situation where on a street you're delivering to like 15 out of 20 houses. Those of us who go around delivering leaflets know that it's often more time efficient to just drop to every house than to pull out specific houses. So is that actually the most efficient and effective way of doing it? Are the water companies avoiding doing that to save money on the cost of bottled water in these emergency situations?
So in terms of the company's ability to respond to emergency situations, this is something where we are changing company licences or have changed company licences. So we're giving ourselves new powers to enforce against companies that fail to provide service in these incidents. So where companies don't deliver, then we will have the power to impose fines on companies. Obviously, the aim here is to get companies to best practice. We'll also work with companies to try to make sure that they share lessons learned from these experiences, because I think it's also vital that we look at what's gone wrong It is often challenging for companies to roll out water distribution in an area, and so it is a question about what can we learn from what hasn't worked, how can we change things for the future, and so we'll work with companies on that. But equally, as we said, we've got new powers in the space, and we will use them.
You say you've got the powers, but you haven't opened an investigation into Southern Water from two major incidents. I find that odd.
It depends whether or not we think they've breached their obligations, and whether we've got complaints about that.
You have to receive a complaint.
No, we don't have to receive a complaint, but clearly if we've received complaints, that may add weight to the need to investigate.
Okay.
Can I take you back, David, to your point about leaks? You kept talking there about inbuilt checks. What do you mean by that?
When companies submit data to us, they don't just submit a total leakage number. They submit details about how they've calculated it, how their water balance has been calculated, and that may reveal information to us which raises questions about how they've made that calculation, and that might lead us to make inquiries, and that's what we do. There's also an assurance process around that which companies provide.
I'm going to move questioning on in a second, but look, you've been exposed to quite a lot of real life outcomes, all produced by a system of regulation that you say has not failed. How much worse are things going to get before we call it failure?
So I think the question is how we respond to the challenges that we see in terms of can we take action to drive improved outcomes. And
the question surely is outcomes.
Yes.
In terms of the lived experience of the people represented around this table, when can we expect to see better outcomes? It sounds to me that we're almost heading to that old territory of the saying the operation was a success but the patient died.
I think you have to look at the total numbers here in terms of the data. So I appreciate people have had very challenging experiences, but when we look across the data water supply interruptions, we actually see significant improvements actually in the period since privatisation. So the question is, will there still be incidents? Yes. Do we want companies to improve performance? Yes. Do we have companies that are not good enough in this space? Yes. Are we taking action to drive better outcomes? Yes. And so the question is, what more could you do? What more should be done? And so I guess I'm not very clear. What is it that you think would change that? We're imposing automatic penalties on companies when they fail to deliver. We are providing an innovation fund to drive better practice. We are, working with other regulators in terms of making sure that there's adequate investment.
The committee will come eventually to what we think maybe needs to change. But you said earlier, you defined the relationship between the customer and the company as being one that really focused around the payment of a bill. But doesn't the point of contact between the company and the customer start when they turn on a tap?
It does, but customers don't see that in terms of so that they turn on the tap, they flush their loo, and that service is provided, and that's great. But I'm talking about when customers rate their water company, they have probably got a particular incident in mind. And the great thing is about water services is that they happen day in, day out without actually intervention. But the question is, when things go wrong, do customers get the redress that they need?
And based on the experience we've heard around the table?
So there are clearly incidents where companies have not done well, and ideally that wouldn't happen. But the question is, as a regulator, what you can do to drive performance to better levels.
Right, we'll move on. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Chair. So now I just want to look a little bit more at Ofwat's strategy and its powers. And I think, as has just been addressed, this is clearly a very complicated position at the moment because financing for the water companies is clearly an issue and we've got questions about how they've structured. On the other hand, we're also fining them for poor behaviour. But equally, we need more innovation and more investment. And so it's sort of all at the same circle. So on that note, what more are you doing or what more could you do to encourage investment and innovation in the sector for the actual companies? And do you think that increased regulation could actually stifle that?
So in terms of what we have done and what we're doing is we are focusing, trying to link companies' revenues, their profits, to good outcomes for customers and the environment. And so we've got automatic incentives which provide penalties, but also actually rewards for companies if they exceed the standards that have been set. So if they beat the level of improvements, for example, on leakage, they can earn a reward for that. So we are trying to drive innovation in the way that we regulate. Chris has touched on the Innovation Fund, which I think has had some success so far, and so we're doubling the scale of that fund, and that's designed to provide a pipeline of new ways of working across the sector. It's accessible to all companies, so we can drive change across all companies.
Do you think that's enough? Because I think obviously some of these companies are going to need even more external investment coming in. And do you think it's actually an attractive prospect at the moment for them? Because in this sort of environment, it doesn't feel like that. So how do you counter that? Because it's all right having these sort of, I appreciate these sort of rewards, but actually, is that enough at this stage?
Yeah, and so that is a question that we get at each price review. We have to set an allowed return on companies on investment, and so we face that's a challenging exercise, and we try to get that right. And so companies have the right of appeal against our decisions as well. When we look at listed companies, so we can look at their share price, that tracks fairly well, showing that the sector remains an attractive prospect. Severn Trent Water raised £1 billion of new equity last year when it issued its business plan. And so there are evidence that we can point to of companies that are able to tap into markets, they're raising debt, they're raising equity, and that does suggest the sector remains attractive to investors. But it is a challenge in terms of a lot of the criticisms of the sector that does unsettle investors. I think investors are looking at the sector with a fresh eye, and I think that does make it challenging for water companies. But we think ultimately a regime which links returns to investors to better services for customers and the environment is one where if customers benefit and the environment benefits, investors benefit, is one where we can try to drive the right kinds of performance.
Could I just add to that? It's as you know, we're getting very close to announcing our final decisions on the price review, which include the rate of return to investors that Dave has just highlighted. And this is my first price review, but what I understand is it's not uncommon at this stage in a price review for the mood music to be, well, Ofwat needs to move. So I think what we're hearing collectively around PR24 has to be seen in that wider context.
Okay. And then in terms of your new powers that you're going to have under the Special Measures Bill, how will you use those to sort of improve and tackle poor performance? And do you think you have enough resources to actually be able to do that?
That's a really good question. And so what the Special Measures Bill does is give Ofwat powers to set the rules for remuneration and governance. We do have powers that we use today. We set out our principles on board leadership, transparency and governance and updated those in 2019. This year was the first year that we used powers that we'd introduced in PR19 to take to stop customers paying for bonuses for executives where we felt that these were not justified in terms of performance for customers and the environment. What these new measures will allow Ofwat to do is to ensure that there is that bonuses would not be paid where they don't meet the expectations that we set out. So that stops bonuses completely. It will allow us to set expectations and to direct companies to involve customers on boards. And it will introduce rules around fitness and proprietary for executive members of boards. So we think with this bill, as it passes through Parliament, we're consulting. We've just closed our consultation on that, and we'll be working through as that bill gets passed to establish the rules in 2025.
Want to ask
Andrew,
I had a couple of questions on that. Firstly, Thames Water's boss took £195,000 bonus for 3 months' work at the end of March. Do you understand why the public are angry?
Absolutely, I can understand that it's really important for companies, if they're going to pay bonuses, to explain to companies why that bonus is justified. And in the report that we just published, we set out our view that that bonus was not justified and was stopping Thames customers from paying for that bonus.
You talked about some of the powers the new bill would give you. In what circumstances should water companies be able to pay those large salaries and bonuses to executives? And do you think any of those companies are currently meeting those standards?
So the rules for setting out how companies will pay bonuses and incentive plans. It is a matter for companies, but they have to comply with the expectations that we set out. We expect companies to explain how bonuses are justified against performance delivery. And through the extra measures that we will introduce, we'll be very clear on circumstances where we feel that they are not justified. So we are consulting, for example, on including the rules around criminal conviction, for example. So if a company has received a criminal conviction, we would expect the company to explain extremely clearly why those bonuses are justified despite that and in the round. In the recent the recent report that we published, we found that 9 companies had not justified the bonuses based on the performance, and we stopped 5 of those companies had already said that customers would not pay. Further 3 we stopped bonuses, including TENS.
Would it be better, given the recent history of playing off bonuses and others, not just for directors to be paid a salary for the job they do?
So whilst I can understand that perspective, it isn't for Ofwat to set exactly how companies should remunerate their executives. I recognise that where bonuses should be paid, then clearly they have to be linked to performance. So we would expect, if we see bonuses that we don't feel are justified, then we would take action.
I'm sorry, but you're telling us that it's not for Ofwat to tell companies how to remunerate 2 minutes after you've told us that you're not going to allow, was it 5 or was it 9, to pay bonuses?
Yeah.
Talk me through that one.
So, Chair, what I meant was it's in response to the question around the balance between base salaries and bonuses. That is a matter for company boards and remuneration committees to make that decision. However, where there is performance-related pay, where we have we use powers currently, and we will have strengthened powers in the Special Measures Bill, we will require those companies to pay performance-related pay in accordance with the expectations that we'll set out.
And you see a role for yourself in determining the performance?
So we would set out the guidance that we expect companies to comply with. And that guidance will really clearly state that bonuses should be paid and aligned to performance for customers and the environment.
Andrew, sorry, I interjected there.
No, I think that was a very good line of thing. I was just going to ask, in most other walks of life, having a criminal conviction would get you sacked, not just losing your bonus.
Yeah.
Do you think the public will accept the verdict you're giving that's just about bonuses?
So the criminal convictions that are applied for the water sector that I've referred to relate to the company. We still believe that it's for leadership, it's for companies to explain what has gone wrong and what they have done as a result of that. And if they cannot explain that and are still rewarding their executive teams with bonuses, that is not acceptable.
Do you think it's acceptable, given you measure performance and the expectations of companies, to say some of those expectations should be about a bonus for having met them, whereas actually for most of us doing our job is the expectation?
I can understand that point of view, and it is on that basis that we determined in our recent report that 9 of those companies had not justified the performance-related pay.
Henry, you wanted to come in? Well, Helen, move on.
Yeah, just on that point regarding criminality, am I right in my understanding of the Special Measures Bill that is currently going through Parliament that it will include new powers, not just to hold the company responsible for criminal activity, but the individual water bosses themselves where necessary?
I believe there are powers that are being introduced that where there is obstruction of investigations that the EA want to undertake, there is potential for powers to be introduced that align to criminal accountability for companies' executive directors, yes.
Before we move on to the next section, I just want to tease out a bit more about this question of criminal convictions. Bonuses are paid in performance in a year. The act that will lead eventually to a criminal conviction, from the commission of the act to the conviction, possibly the conclusion of any appeals, how long is that taking at the moment?
It could take, we've seen between 3 to 5 years between an act and the criminal conviction.
And as a meaningful sanction then, how's that working?
So the way that we're proposing these rules to apply and the way that we've applied our performance-related pay recovery mechanism is that the year in which a criminal conviction was secured is the year that the executive is held accountable. Now, I appreciate that the executive team that is in place may not be the one that was in place at the time. However, it's important that companies explain what it is that they have done and how the executive team has addressed that if they are paying bonuses in that year.
Let's just come back to the point earlier about who owns and operates water companies. These are people, bankers, financial institutions, everyone else, who live in this world of bonuses. So that's why they expect this sort of remuneration packages. Are these the right people to be providing a public service like water?
I think it's really important to think about the balance of leadership and not just on the board but on the executive team. I think that we've explained earlier that we'd introduced rules around governance that required companies to demonstrate that they have a balance of independent non-executive directors as well as...
Have you considered the position of the banks prior to 2008 when you look at the performance of your own sector?
Could I just clarify, Chair, what was...
I mean, look, it seems to me as an outsider that effectively you're back in exactly the same position. You've got complex governance structures, complex ownership models, people getting significant bonuses as part of their base package. And I wonder just the extent to which the non-execs in this sector, who should be the meaningful break in this, are actually performing any useful function.
Thanks for clarifying. And we think that is a key contention, and that's why we have strengthened our requirements on board leadership and governance. We introduced requirements for the first time in 2013, I believe. We updated those in 2019. We think more effective governance of water companies would help drive better outcomes. We think there are limits to what regulators can achieve. We need to see better decisions be made in the boardroom. That depends on having the right people on boards, as you've correctly observed. There needs to be a balance of engineering, operational talent, as well as other backgrounds. And actually one of the measures of the new bill will give us ability to look at that sort of balance of skills. We also think there are questions about the decisions being taken by a board and how effective they are and the role of owners in companies. And so that is an area that we are doing further work in. Yes.
Okay, Jane.
Yeah, I was going to ask a bit more about the balance on the board, but it seems that they'll be moving there anyway. So it seems that you're kind of looking at a private company structure that may be moving towards more of almost a regulated control structure. How far will that go? What will those boards, do you think, in the future? Who will they comprise? How will they be picked? How far can you go with that, I suppose? How much difference can you make? And how can you control the limit of decisions that they can make?
Yeah, so I think in terms of where we've started from was actually trying to make the boards work more like boards of listed companies. So there are a set of requirements in terms of stock exchange listings around boards, which we think are a good starting point. And so our initial focus was making boards of private equity firms operate consistent with requirements of listed companies. There's the UK Corporate Governance Code as well, which we think is another helpful building block. But Helen, do you want to talk a bit more about the reform programme we have in this space?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that boards act effectively and can effectively challenge leadership teams. And so to do that, you do need a range of skills on boards. We do hold pre-appointment meetings with new proposed NEDs before they are confirmed in. And that's an opportunity for us to understand what skills that individual brings to the company, what understanding they have of the water sector, of Ofwat, and how they're going to exercise that duty of oversight. So we do think it's really important. It's part of the need for companies to demonstrate how they are making decisions in the interests of customers and the environment. And part of the work that we'll be doing is, through the Special Measures Bill is looking at the composition of boards and how we can make them more effective.
We've got 40 minutes remaining. I promise I'll bite my tongue. But we've still got some quite significant areas I want to cover. So, Josh, you were going to lead on the price review cycle.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. David, you mentioned at the top of the session that across several price reviews since privatisation, that process has saved consumers money. But I think we know that at this point we can't continue with below inflation price increases, and we can see from the draft determinations that all of our constituents are likely to face some quite significant increases on their bills in the coming 5 years. So I suppose the underlying question with all of this is, how is this price review going to tackle the long-standing issues of underinvestment and underperformance in the sector?
I'll turn to Chris. There's a couple of points probably to make usefully in advance. One is a key driver of bill levels is the level of investment. And so the level of investment is going to increase very significantly at this price review. So we're draft determination that was a 300% increase from previous price reviews. And it's likely to go up further at final determination. The other key component of bills is companies' allowed returns. So that's returns that go back to investors to make the sector attractive for investors to invest in and for the sector to raise new finance. And those rates of return fell, if you like, across consecutive price reviews, which helped keep bills down up until the current period. Those rates of return in line with interest rates elsewhere are going up. And so that's another upward pressure on bills. We think this level of investment will be game-changing. So this is going to produce a dramatic increase in investment to reduce particularly sewage discharges, but also to upgrade wastewater treatment works, and as Chris talked about, upgrade water treatment works as well. Then there's a question for us in terms of, can the sector deliver against this challenge? So we're talking about a massive increase in work for the supply chain. So how do we make sure the sector's well placed to deliver? Chris, do you want to talk about the work?
Thanks, David, and thank you for the question, and congratulations on becoming a father. Being a dad's the best thing that ever happened to me. So let me set out what our price review is, the goals we want to achieve with PR24, and what I think that means for our decisions on the 19th of December. So the price review is one of our main tools for overseeing the sector. It's something we do once every 5 years. It has three core components. The first core component are the costs that we allow companies to run themselves day to day and to maintain their water and wastewater networks. In return for those allowances, companies commit to levels of performance on things that matter to customers and the environment. There are about 24 of those performance commitments, and we've talked about some of them today. Around those performance commitments, there is a regime of rewards and penalties. So if companies outperform their performance commitments and customers benefit, they're entitled to charge their customers more. Conversely, if they underperform, they are penalised, and that money is automatically returned to customers. The third component of the price review is what David has touched on. It's financial. It is the fair rate of return that we allow investors, and it is the level and profile of bills over time. Now, for PR24, we want to achieve four things with our final decisions in December. The first is to link this next 5-year investment cycle more closely to some of those long-term goals, as David has set those out in terms of the resilience of our water supplies and environmental improvements. The second goal is to link investment more closely to the needs and the wants of customers and their communities, so that the investment that's taking place is what resonates with customers and communities and what they need. The third is for there to be a step change in the environmental and social value of investment. So we have much more green investment than we did before. We have performance commitments linked to improving biodiversity, reducing operational greenhouse gases, and reducing pollution incidents. And the final thing is the thing that we always do in the price review, which is to drive investment through innovation and efficiency. So what do I think that means for the decisions that we will announce on the 19th of December? I think we will see record levels of investment to safeguard the health of our rivers, our seas and our waterways. I think we will see record levels of investment to improve the resilience of our water supplies. I think we will see incentives for companies to really raise their game on performance that matters to customers and the environment, and we will see all that at a level of bills that I think is fair for customers and a rate of return that is fair for investors.
Okay, just a couple of follow-ups on that, if I may. If we're saying that, I mean, it sounds like a great picture going forward, but if we're saying that the rate of investment is going up massively and the rates of return are going to reduce or, you know, keep track with inflation, does that not suggest that over past price reviews, the level of investment has been way too low and the rate of return has been too high, therefore? And also, just on the point around, you mentioned tripling the investment in new infrastructure. We know that a lot of our existing infrastructure is in a really bad condition. So how much of that is going to be put into remedial works for what we already have?
So I think I would push back against that characterisation that our price reviews have meant there hasn't been enough innovation. As I set out earlier, the price review's job is to scrutinise proposals that are made to us to ensure they're good value for money, and then to hold companies to account for those proposals. It's not our job to say what goes in those proposals. It's the job of water companies, and that's in large part determined by the demands of our sister regulators, the Environment Agency and its Welsh equivalent, Natural Resources Wales, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, even Natural England and the UK and Welsh governments. If the criticism is that the price review did not scrutinise things it was never asked to scrutinise, I do not think that's fair.
But I think it's an interesting point in terms of the investment planning process. So we do think there's a question if the investment planning process produces a 300 to 400% increase in investment at this price review. There is a question about why that didn't come through in previous price reviews, and we think that's something that will be explored in terms of the work the Government Commission is doing.
Okay. If I might move on. So the Consumer Council for Water suggested that around 40% of consumers will struggle to afford proposed increases. So how do you balance the need for that, you know, really vital investment with the need to protect consumers at the same time?
It is true that bills will rise to finance investment. At our draft determinations, there was an average annual bill increase of 22%, which works out to £19 a year. We are concerned about the evidence that we gathered with the Consumer Council for Water on affordability, and there are a number of things that we're doing in the price review to mitigate that. The first is our process of scrutiny of companies' proposals will ensure that customers don't pay a penny more than they have to for this vital investment. In particular, that they won't pay twice for things that they have already paid water companies to do, the water companies have not done. We are also ring-fencing in our final determinations customer money for investment. So that money will only be used for investment. It won't leak out into dividends or it won't leak out into executive bonuses. And if it is not used for investment, it will automatically be clawed back and returned to customers in the form of lower bills. Our final determinations will also see a doubling in financial support social tariffs to customers in need of a helping hand, from 4% to 8% of customers. You will know better than I that the department finished a consultation on extending the social tariffs, from companies to national, and that will be a decision for Parliament and for the government. And then finally, David has already mentioned improvements to the priority services register and some of the changes to the government guaranteed standards scheme for returning customers money when performance isn't as it could be. And together, I think those things will ensure that bill increases for customers are fair and fund the investment, the much-needed investment.
Given that those ring fences are about to be put in to protect money for investment, do you think that consumers in the past have been offered good value for money by water companies?
I think customer bills have been low because investment, the drivers for investment haven't made sufficient investment for bills to be higher. I know our role as the regulator has been to keep bills as low as possible but no lower, and levels of support have been where they were in the sector. That's been largely a matter for the companies. I think the key thing now is that we are seeing a tripling in investment. We have seen a tripling in investment expenditure at draft determinations, and we will see a bigger increase at final determinations. And the protections that I've described to you put in place will ensure that customers don't pay a penny more than they need to for that vital investment.
Okay. Just lastly, as we often do see, some commentators in the sector are saying that the draft determinations will limit the ability of companies to improve infrastructure, secure investment. How would you respond to that?
I think it's not uncommon at this stage in the price review process for commentators to say Ofwat's going to have to move from its draft determination position. I think what's different is the process normally goes as follows. The companies submit proposals on those three core components I described earlier to us. We scrutinise those proposals and we pair them back. We did that for our draft determinations in July. Companies and others then push back against our draft determinations. There's some toing and froing, and final determinations end up somewhere in the middle. I think what's different this time is that the first two parts of that process went as they normally do. We received proposals on those three core components, we paired them back. But companies, in their representations to us, double down and more. They asked for an extra £7 billion on top of what was requested in their original requests, and that was driven in very large part by the requirements of our sister organisations. But we will still be in a position to have scrutinised that, to ensure that customers only pay what they need to pay for this vital investment when we announce our draft decisions on the 19th of final decisions, on the 19th of December.
And clearly leveraging private investment, as you said earlier, is going to be really key to keeping bills down, but also maximising investment.
It is.
And Sarah touched on this earlier, around the sort of 3.72% return on investment. Are there other ways you think that, other than the pure return on investment, that we can make the sector an attractive investment prospect? So I'm thinking maybe things like consumer satisfaction. You mentioned some best practice that's going on in the industry that perhaps we could share more widely. You know, there are other wider things we can do to make it more of an attractive investment prospect so that we can keep bills down.
Yes. So I can't tell you what the base rate of return for final determinations is going to be, but what I can say is financial markets have moved since the information that we used in September, and we are not blind and deaf to that fact. But the base return is augmented by money that companies can make from outperforming the performance commitments that we described. And as Helen set out earlier, we've gone from having a dozen common ones there to 24, so we as the regulator have got an even tighter grip. And if companies deliver for their customers, they can earn a rate of return greater than that base return, and that ought to be enough to attract investment into the sector. I am confident that the final determinations that we announce on the 19th of December will provide a bedrock for the sector and an investable proposition.
I think just one build on that, Chris, is about the balance of risk as well. So one of the key things from an investor perspective is not just the return, it's about the risk. And so what we thought very carefully about is, given companies are facing this significant challenge to deliver major infrastructure, how can we make sure that we're getting this balance of risk and return right? We're not proposing unnecessary risks that drives up the cost of capital, but equally holding companies to account. So one of the ways we've done that, for example, is with major projects. We're taking those outside the price review. We're dealing with those by a competitive procurement process. So it's these projects which are often the most difficult for companies to deliver. So that will go through a competitive market route, and firms will bid to supply, and that will take care of risk and return. We're also thinking very carefully about risk sharing rates in terms of on new infrastructure and investment. And so we are doing a range of measures to try to calibrate that balance of risk correctly, because often investors are represented to us as not so much about the level of returns, it's about the balance of risk. And so if we can strike that balance, that will enable us to drive the right outcomes for customers and the environment without driving up the cost of capital unnecessarily.
Henry, you wanted to come in? I'm keen to move on.
Very quickly, it's about supply chain. You mentioned supply chain. I was wondering about Ofwat's role in the supply chain. Often water companies are very keen to hide behind if there's an issue been happening in terms of sewage discharge. They say, oh, well, there's a delay on the supply chain, so the sewage has to keep going into the waterways.
So we don't think that's an acceptable excuse. Water companies have a licence, they have an obligation to deliver against their obligations, but nonetheless the way the sector works with the supply chain is going to be vital. So if I could characterise the last 6 price reviews as having a roughly constant level of investment, so investment has grown slightly over time, but so that's a relatively stable market for companies to operate in. Then clearly they have to step up and deliver this huge increase, and so that is really going to test and challenge the supply chain. So we've tried to help that by signalling early in terms of the level of investment. We've also allowed companies to bring forward investment from 2025 into the current year and into the most previous year. So some companies have made an early start on this investment, which obviously allows the supply chain to start bidding against these contracts. And we're also trying to work in terms of the longer term to signal again that this is not just going to be an investment for a brief period of time. This will carry on beyond the 5-year period. Actually, some in terms of the supply chain coming into the sector, we're sending very positive signals as well.
Andrew, move on to Thames.
I've got a few questions about Thames Water, which I presume you may have been expecting there would be some. Len, it always strikes me, I represent a city in Anglian Water, and it strikes me that something has reached significance when in community meetings and others, people in my patch recognise the national significance of what's happening at Thames Water for all of us. So Thames Water is facing those significant financial and operational challenges. It'd be good to know how you think it reached this point, and whether, given the scale of the challenges, you actually think Ofwat has the skills and expertise to be able to manage those challenges.
Yes, thank you for your question. So I think two clear things have gone wrong at Thames. One is operational performance. So the company's really struggled to deliver against the performance requirements that we expect of it, and more so than most other companies. And so as benefits we have as a regulator, we can benchmark companies and their performance, and what we see at Thames is they've struggled to deliver the same kinds of performance that other companies have in different parts of the country. That, with our regime, which we talked about, which have applied increasing penalties on companies, meaning that their investors are bearing the consequences for this poor performance, which has then fed into the second issue, which is their lack of adequate financial resilience. So that's the buffer or the headroom they have to withstand shocks and challenges that they meet. And so Thames' level of debt was higher than other companies. I don't just mean in absolute terms, but I mean as a ratio in terms of their assets. And so they had less headroom, if you like, going into the set of operational challenges. They've tried unsuccessfully to turn themselves around in recent years, and that's reached the point that's led their owners, or the current owners, to refuse to invest further in the business. So that's precipitated, if you like, the current crisis. I touched on earlier, I think there are lessons in terms of how we regulate company finances, and that we should do more earlier to stop companies getting into this position. But nonetheless, as I said, the regime at privatisation always anticipated that a company could fail. And perhaps you might say after 30 years, we haven't yet reached that point, but that's clearly the challenge in front of us. It is an extremely challenging situation, so it's complex. There's billions of pounds of debt. There's lots of different interest groups. So in terms of how we're managing this process, one is we're obviously applying lots more scrutiny to this company. We've made sure we've got the specialist advisors. We're working closely with the government in this space as well. Where the company's at with the process, its current equity holders have refused to invest further. It's therefore engaging in a process with both its debt holders and potential new investors. Its aim is obviously to secure new investment coming into the company, and it's working with its creditors to assess whether or not that needs to include a financial restructuring, that is a restructuring of the debt to the business. If that process happens, that's what we refer to as a market resolution of these outcomes. So the outcome would be a new investor comes into the company is de-geared, and that new investor will also need to take responsibility for securing the turnaround of the operational performance of the business, because that's ultimately the outcome we want to get to, is a business which is recapitalised and its performance is turned around. What we're trying to do as a regulator is to ensure that customers do not bear the consequences of the previous financing decisions of the company or of their poor operational performance. And so that is the test of the regime. Can we work through this process? Can we make sure that customers' interests are protected? That even though the company may fail, customers still get service, and that ultimately there will be a new or turned around company steps into the situation. It is a challenging situation, but it's one that I think we are confident that we can address and manage the issues that are in front of us.
And what you described, I think, is some of the catastrophic failures, privatisation around the Thames Water model. Do you recognise some people will also say it's not just a failure of Thames Water, it's a failure of Ofwat to have allowed it to get to this point?
Yes, I can see that, and we certainly speak to people who hold those views. As I said, at privatisation, the focus of the government was not to say don't stop companies going bust. The focus was to say to have a regime so that if it works through, we can protect customers' interests. And it has to be said that the level of debt at Thames is the same as Heathrow Airport, and you see other companies BT, for example, gears at the same level as water companies do as well. So it's not in a sense, when you say the regulator should have stopped this is not a problem that's just in the water sector, or it's a choice of financing arrangements. Debt is a low-cost source of financing. It's important to the water sector. It was very clear at privatisation that debt was going to be part of the solution. I think some companies like Thames have taken it too far, but again the question is, does this come back on customers, or does the problem sit with investors? And that is the test of the regime.
Do you think that debt loading by Thames Water, maybe some other companies, has enabled some of them to get out of some of the responsibilities they have?
It shouldn't do, and I don't think it has done, but I think that is the challenge that we face as a regulator, that the companies will say this is the regulator's problem and not ours, and so that's why we're very insistent that the company addresses these financing issues.
You're comfortable with the level of debt loading?
No, I think, as I said, coming back, I think if we were to regulate, if we were to run this again, I think Ofwat should intervene earlier to stop companies reaching such high debt levels. That wouldn't necessarily have stopped Thames facing the issues, but it may have helped. It would have given them more headroom when they've reached these financial problems. But I don't think we should try to prevent companies getting into trouble. But I do think that we could have forced and taken action, if we had the powers to do so, to stop companies entering into such high gearing structures. So I think that would be a better approach. We've tried to do that as a regulator. We put new measures into our price review at the last period. They were thrown out on appeal by the CMA. We've only got licence change powers since 2021. The first use of our powers was to introduce new financial resilience requirements. And so, in a sense, the question here is, did we have the powers as a regulator when we were set up to do this? The answer is no. And so I think that is an important lesson.
Thank you. I think one of the frustrations that may be coming through some of our questions is that we seem to have a lot of discussion around how things could be done differently. We're looking in the rear view mirror. Very little about sense of urgency about where we're driving towards. And I think that may be a sense of frustration. If the restructuring of debt fails for Thames Water, what would a special admin procedure involve?
The Special Administrator is appointed by the Secretary of State on advice from Ofwat, and the role of the Special Administrator would be to take control of the business, to ensure service is provided to customers, and then to set about restructuring the business and then finding a new owner for the business ultimately, and then it would transition back into private ownership.
And did I tell earlier in your question that what we could actually see is a phoenix from the ashes? So could we see a new Thames Water come through a special admin process being launched for investment?
We could, and so that would be a potential outcome. The challenge with special administration is obviously making sure that there's no adverse impact on customers during this process, and obviously there may be there will be a cost to running the process as well. And so there are effectively two options to get to these outcomes. One is a market resolution, one is a special administration. Special administration applies in the case of insolvency, so the company is not insolvent at present. There's also performance-based criteria, and that's something that we keep under consideration. I just want to touch on your earlier point about looking forward, because I mean, a lot of the questions have been looking back. We certainly think, as I say, learning the lessons from the past, that we do. That's why we're introducing new controls on gearing, and in terms of the issues about water supplies in the future, why we think climate change is really important, and why we're working as a regulator to help drive change to make sure we've got the resilience that the sector needs in the future. We're very clear that change is needed, and so I don't want to leave the committee with the view that this is all about looking backwards. In fact, I think what the challenges show is the sector hasn't adapted to change fast enough. So customer expectations have changed, society's changed, the sector hasn't moved with those changes, and we as a regulator need to be part of that as well.
Henry, I'm going to let Helen move it on, and then I'll come to you at the end if I can, because if we're looking forward, that seems a natural progression. Helen.
Thank you, Chair, and I will keep this section brief because I'm conscious colleagues need to come in. Andrew has talked about the issues with Thames Water. Much of that has been attributed to Macquarie, who have invested heavily in Thames Water and are an Australian investment bank. Two parts to my question. Do you think it's appropriate that an Australian investment bank has such a large stake in one of our most basic utilities? And what are you doing at Ofwat to make sure the same does not now happen with Southern Water? with Macquarie now investing heavily in Southern Water. So how are you going to stop what happened to Thames Water happening to Southern Water?
And so the simple answer to that is the rules have changed, and so we're very clear in terms of the controls that we've introduced around dividend payments. And so the questions at Thames Water was that during Macquarie's tenure is that large amounts of dividends were paid. We have changed the rules around that to be very clear that dividends need to be linked to performance. And in particular at Southern Water, they're now in what's called cash lock-up, so they're prohibited by their licence from paying dividends out. Macquarie's have invested so far £1.6 billion into Southern Water, so I guess I'm pleased to say that the money's going the other way. It's going into Southern Water. Southern Water face a very clear set of challenges. We're very clear with our understanding of the regime, and with Macquarie's we communicated that to them. There are letters on our website. It's all in the public domain in terms of setting the expectations to make sure that they understood what their responsibilities were as investors in this sector. In their view, they've changed their model. It's a question for them, but we're very clear as the regulator that they need to invest to turn around this business, and that we will hold them to account in terms of making sure that dividends don't flow out of that company until they're delivering the performance customers would expect.
On that question of, do you have any inherent sense of nervousness about an Australian investment bank investing so heavily in our utilities?
I don't have anything particular against Australians, despite being from New Zealand myself. The sector needs to raise investment and does so from a broad range of international sources. So we have Canadian pension funds, we have UK pension funds, we have investors from around the world. It is a capital-intensive business. It needs to raise capital. The best way to do that, at the lowest cost, is to go to international markets. So there's not a problem with that as such. But we actually have more concern about consortium-owned companies, because I think they raise more problems about consortiums not agreeing. We saw that at Thames in terms of to put in new funding. But as I say, it's about the regime and making sure that investors understand that they are focused on the long term. We're very clear about the performance that would be expected in order for the company to earn returns. At the moment, Southern are incurring penalties year after year because of their performance failures. That goes to the detriment of Macquarie's. We do not have powers at the moment to vet owners in the sector. That's a question for the government, but I guess the caution I would have is if you start limiting investors, is you've got more limited pools of capital, the sector does have to raise money.
Yep. Moving swiftly on, the boss of Southern Water received a bonus for last financial year of £183,000. The Chief Financial Officer, £128,000. Given the instance that we've heard about from colleagues today, massive sewage pollution under their watch, incidences of flooding in many communities caused by Southern Water, major water outages, do you understand why our constituents feel shocked that such failure is rewarded with that kind of bonus? And mindful of time, I know that the new powers that are going through Parliament, the Water Special Measures Bill, will give you the power in future to stop bonuses such as that. You did not have those powers when these bonuses were paid. Had you had those powers, would you have banned these two bonuses?
I'm going to pick that question up.
Yeah, absolutely. So we would have taken... the powers that we used are the powers that we introduced in the price control to stop customers from paying bonuses where we feel they are not justified. We looked at Southern Water's bonuses and felt they were not justified based on their performance for customers and the environment. We would have applied those rules to prevent customers being paid, but Southern Water had already not charged customers for those bonuses.
But now you will have powers in the new legislation to totally ban them, not just to ban them from being paid from the customers' pockets.
Yes.
So would you have used those powers to ban these bonuses completely?
Yes, we felt that the bonuses for Southern Water bosses were not justified by performance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And we understand the public anger about this. I think it has brought the sector into disrepute. Coming back, I think, to the questions at the start, I think it's not just performance of companies which has led the sector to face its troubles. It's the perception that company bosses and investors have done well while services hasn't been provided.
It's the lived experience of people in our communities as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Henry, you've behaved.
I just wanted to, about the relaunch of the IPO with Thames Water, and I was wondering whether those costs would be recoverable under the Special Measures Bill.
Sorry, so if the company goes into special administration...
You talked about relaunching it, Thames Water, under an IPO, and I was wondering whether the costs of that would be recoverable under the Special Measures Bill.
I think there are two things that may be confused. I'm not trying to understand your question. So the Special Measures Bill, so the government has given the power to, if it puts a company into special administration and it incurs losses from doing so, the ability to recover that from customers. That's one potential issue. I think if the company restructures itself and launches on the lists itself, then that is a question for the company, and the costs about doing that will be a question for it. So it could choose to list without anything to do with.
You'd be still impacted by those costs, right? If they're relaunching under an IPO, there'd still be an impact.
So the company would incur those costs. That's right. But we set the benefit. Say we have as a regulator, we set costs on a benchmark basis. So it's not driven specifically by the costs that Thames would incur. But we would seek to encourage companies to list on the stock market actually, and so we are considering in the price review, do we reflect the costs? If a company that's not listed now does list, and there are costs associated with the listing, should those be recoverable from customers? And we think there's a case for doing that. But
my question is, does the Special Measures Bill allow you to get those costs back? Are they recoverable?
I don't think it does. I don't think that's covered by the Special Measures Bill, but I might be not understanding your question correctly, I fear.
The Special Measures Bill gives Ofwat powers to set remuneration and governance for executive members of the water companies. So it's not relating to...
There is the question about the government has talked about giving itself powers to recover the costs of a company in special administration from other water customers, and so there will be two triggers for that. One is the company would have to be in special administration, and the second is that the government would have to be out of pocket. We think the most likely scenario is actually the business has got £20 billion of assets that that business would be sold, and the government wouldn't ultimately be out of pocket. But if it does, the Special Measures Bill gives the government the option to recover that from customers. I don't think that's a question for us.
Okay, just before we move on from the question of Southern, because this is very much a forward-looking rather than a rear-view mirror point, but it is very important. Southern is currently attracting additional finance at rates that are above the market average, and indeed that's above your own suggested rate for new debt. This looks suspiciously like what happened in Thames. So what impact do you think this would have on Southern? And what are you going to do about it? What powers do you have?
So the way we set the cost of debt, as you observed, is based on the sector average. So when we have a company like Southern that has financing issues, then those costs fall back on its investors, in this case, the Macquaries that you have referred to. So that's a question for the company and its own finances. The difference between Thames and Southern Water is that Macquarie's have already invested, or their investment funds have invested over £1.6 billion. Similar scale in Thames would probably be an amount of about £4 billion. So we think that gives the owners of Southern Water a much stronger interest in ensuring that they can finance themselves. What they have said is that they do plan to inject more equity into Southern, which is what we and rating agencies think needs to happen. They'll do that following the final determination that we set out in December. We will continue to engage with them and to press them that that investment comes forward. Until they do so, they will face the consequences of facing higher costs in the bond market and where they raise money. What we're very clear about is that customers don't pay for that. That's a question for their investors.
If I could just add to that, the costs that will be reimbursed in the final determinations will be the average cost of debt issued in the market across the sector. So Southern will receive that, but its debt issuance cost will be higher, and it will face that.
Average cost, is that the base metric?
So it's defined as there is a benchmark in the market for the issuance of debt for companies like that. We then look at whether debt has been issued below, at or above that benchmark. In the current period, debt has tended to be issued above that benchmark, including Southern's debt and one or two others. So that issuance will be reflected in the costs, the day-to-day costs of running the companies, which I described earlier in our final determinations in December.
Okay, I think we might return to that someday. You'll be pleased to hear we're coming to the final round of questions. It will take us, I'm afraid, a bit beyond 12 noon. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but this is important material that we do need to cover. So, Jenny, can I ask
Thank you, Chair. So we're going to cover off, finally, environmental performance and enforcement. Over the last couple of years, we've seen £300 million in fines and penalties, yet at the same time, we've not seen an increase in performance, an improvement in performance, and we've seen increases instead in sewage and spillage incidents. Why are these penalties not an effective deterrent?
So I think in terms of addressing improving companies' performance, I think there's probably three key elements I would see. One is there's a question about companies' compliance with their current legal requirements. And so we have live enforcement action against all wastewater companies. We've announced draft decisions to impose fines of £164 million on 3 companies. And so there's a set of questions about their compliance with the law. And then we don't just fine companies, we also issue requirements for companies to bring themselves back into compliance with the law. That will help, but compliance is not good enough. We need to see companies improve their performance, and so we think financial incentives have a role in that process. So this is setting penalties on the level of each pollution incident. But you're absolutely right. I don't think that in itself that helps. That helps gives investors the incentives to drive company management to improve. But we also need to be, and this is coming back to the Chair's challenge about how we're changing our role as a regulator. I think if you'd spoken to us 5 years ago, we'd said we'd set the incentives and expect that to do the job. As Helen talked about earlier, we now sit down and engage with the company. We talk to them about their plans, what they're doing to improve, in particular to identify what's driving the pollution incident. So when you talk to a company, it's not usually just one cause. They may have a problem with a particular part of the infrastructure. So it's getting to that, understanding what's driving that incident, and then how can they change the operational practices, how can they change their maintenance, how can they change their investment plans to address those issues. And then it may also require differences in approach, innovation, and that comes back to the role of the Innovation Fund that we set out.
What is the most, you talked about sitting down with the water companies and understanding kind of what drives it. What, in your experience, is the most common reason for those spillage or sewage incidents that you see?
So often, conversations that I have with the water companies, they explain that there are failures, often power failures at the wastewater treatment works. So building power resilience and backup power is really important to companies. Parts of their assets may fail either because they have not been used within the ways that they should be, or they needed to be replaced or maintained. And part of it is actually response. So when something starts to spill, understand that, get out there, look at it and solve the problem before it becomes a breach of permits.
Just building on that, I think one of the challenges you face with companies is that often they're not quick enough to get to the root causes, what's driving the problem. So, understanding not just at that particular sewage treatment works what happens, but understanding the lessons for all their sewage treatment works. So I think getting companies to understand, because when we talk to companies, the better companies have a sort of a clear line of sight between their actions they're taking and the outcomes that they're getting. When we talk to companies that are struggling with their performance, they often have a much poorer grasp on what's going wrong, or what's causing what's going wrong, should I say, in order to correct it.
Which are the better companies?
So in terms of the better performers we've seen in the current period, so companies like Wessex Water, Severn Trent, United Utilities in some areas of its performance. Yes.
Can I just add that in the case of United Utilities, they are proactively using AI-enabled tools to target maintenance in advance of something needing to be something going wrong, and we think that's a model that could be exported to the rest of the
spills and leaks.
Yes.
Yeah. So one thing that comes up with me, and I'm sure with my fellow committee members a lot whenever we talk to constituents about sewage in particular, is the question of, will we ever get to a point where that we're sewage spill free? Will our infrastructure, I appreciate our infrastructure is incredibly old, is incredibly complex, and some of the issues that you said asked just a moment ago about the most frequent reasons for those kind of the sewage spills that we experience are incredibly complex and hard to manage. Will this country ever get to a point where our rivers, our canals, our waterways and our seas are sewage free?
In terms of the government's targets, so getting to zero serious pollution incidents is the expectation. So that's on the pollution incidents which cause serious harm. At the other end of the scale, in terms of sewage discharges, the government goals and plan is by 2050 for the sector to have all sewage discharge points operated at no more than 10 times per year. So it's not to get to zero in the space. Yep. The reason for that is practicality. The problem is not so much the age of the infrastructure. I've seen some wonderful examples of very old assets operating very well, and seen some examples of some younger assets failing quite early in life. So, but it is about the integration of surface water drainage and wastewater systems. I think we are, about to uncover a lot of good ways of driving down sewage discharges. So I've been on sites where we've seen local government assets on surface water drainage directly connected into sewers, leading to sewage spills. I think getting a much better grip on what's driving the problem, taking action to prevent it. But this is about stopping rainwater getting into sewers, and then building storage and smart technology on networks to help better manage the excesses when they happen. And then finally, at the other end, in terms of the treatment. So, for example, some companies have been trialling reed bed treatments on sewage discharges. So if you do have a sewage discharge point which is operating, treat it and make sure that the discharges coming out of it are fine. And so that's, at the moment, that's not permitted by the Environment Agency in terms of as a resolution, but it is as a direction of travel. So we think we can do much better. But in terms of the current aspirations is not to get down to zero sewage spills. I appreciate that will be frustrating for people. We think the sector needs to take action to drive down sewage spills by, quite dramatically over the next 5 years. But we're not going to get to the point of getting to zero sewage spills.
Okay, understood. You talked, David, earlier about the investigation that's ongoing, has been ongoing since 2021, and I appreciate, and you mentioned that there has been already, I think it's 168 million pounds in fines that have been issued to Thames, Yorkshire and Northumbria and Worcester. Why is it taking so long, and when can we expect this investigation to conclude?
Yeah, so I share your appetite. I would like to see these resolved as soon as possible. We have increased the level of our resources in our enforcement function. So since I've become Chief Executive, we've trebled the scale of that, and that's helped us cope with this workload. But each of these investigations is complex, serious. We've also faced legal action from companies to slow us down. So Thames Water took a judicial review against Ofwat at an early stage. That put our work on hold for several months, but we are making good progress. We've issued a draft decision for them. We will try to follow. Obviously, we're not be careful not prejudging the outcomes of any of these investigations as well, but we will reach a resolution, whether that's decide not to take action further or whether to progress to final on those three companies. And then we're making good progress in terms of the other three companies that we started on in 2021. More recently, we've opened investigations against 4 further companies, and we'll endeavour to close those as soon as we can as well.
Great. Thank you.
Right. I've got 3 colleagues who want to come in very briefly, or they wanted to come in and they will be brief. I'm going to take them all at once and then just leave you to have a wrap-up. So Sarah, then Helen, and then Jane.
Thank you, Chair. Just a specifically Somerset question. In May 2023, Natural England changed the condition status of the Somerset levels SSSIs to unfavourable and declining due to poor water quality from a combination of domestic, agricultural and sewage waste in rivers. That on top of the letter that we received in 2020, August 2020, which obviously was around the phosphates issue, which has put the knock-on effect being a moratorium on house building. So why, despite large fines to water companies, does this still take place to the extent that it does? And what additional powers or improvements are needed to clean up the mess?
Okay, hold that thought.
There's been a lot of discussion about the monitors on pipes to monitor sewage discharges, and obviously a lot of work going on to increase the number of them to make sure all the pipes are monitored as part of the Water Special Measures Bill. Previously, the discharges have only been measured by length of time, duration, but we have the technology to measure the volume of sewage discharged. Do you think that should change? And do you as Ofwat have the powers to implement that change?
Okay, and Jane.
Mine is just a really quick one. That judicial review you mentioned against Ofwat, who paid the fees for that?
Right, so Somerset levels, I'm not familiar with detail with the issues that, in terms of what's driving the issues in that catchment. You're probably right, it's probably a mixture of wastewater, agriculture, maybe urban runoff if there is any. Generally what we'd like to see in that space is catchment-based approaches. So at the moment, this is where can we work more on a catchment basis? Can we align what water companies are doing to get better outcomes with those work with farmers and other sources of the issue? So it's coming up with a catchment plan, identifying what needs to be done. Some of it around will be in investment. What we are observing is we're running hard up against the technically achievable limits. So the government, as part of the recent legislation, required water companies in these areas to come to not just build wastewater treatment works to their economically beneficial level, but to go all the way to what's technically achievable. And so if they do that, then there's perhaps nothing more that can be done in that particular wastewater treatment work. So then it's the question about how do we work in the catchment to make sure we're taking out the phosphorus in the most sensible way. And I think there probably are better ways, but I'd have to come back to the specifics on that. Event duration. So I don't think it's within our powers actually to specify. It is a. I think that's an Environment Agency measure, but I'd have to check exactly on that. So at the moment, the plan is to measure event, the time and the duration. We think that gives us a good sense of what's going on, and we can incentivise companies to take action to reduce sewage discharges, and that's what we will be doing in the next price review period. The judicial review would have been part of Thames cost base. So we set costs on a benchmark basis, so we can protect customers from paying for those costs. So effectively that will come back on Thames investors.
Can I just clarify, David, on that point, it sits with the EA, so it's something we need to ask the EA?
I will check on that.
Could you come back to us?
you, because I
Thank you.
just don't want to...
There are government regulations called MC regs that prescribe how event duration monitors are to work, but they are given effect by the directives of the EA.
Just before you go, the Mirror reports South West Water's owners paid out more than $1.5 billion to shareholders. Last week, South West Water pled guilty to fresh charges of dumping raw sewage after it was fined £2 million in a separate prosecution in 2023. Can dividends be blocked due to environmental performance?
We have introduced new requirements requiring companies to demonstrate that dividends are linked to performance for customers and the environment. That is a judgment made in the round. We are conscious that dividends are important from an investability perspective of the sector. What we will look at is we will assess whether companies have complied with those requirements. We have live enforcement action against Thames Water for the payment of a dividend. We will take action against other companies if we think that's justified. But that said, we would look at the performance of South West Water in the round.
Does it begin to look like taxpayers just pouring water into a sink with no plug in it?
So I think the Mirror article isn't. The question is whether it's accurately characterising the way the government subsidy works, and so it wouldn't have. The level of dividends that South West Water are paying are from the returns that are allowed for in the price review. Whether or not the government subsidy occurred would not have, as far as I can see, affected the level of dividend.
I shall leave you to raise your concerns directly with the Mirror and wish you as much joy with it as we doubtless have from time to time. David, Helen, Chris, thank you very much for your attendance. We've covered a lot of ground today. I hope that you found it helpful and that in terms of producing better outcomes for all our constituents, that this is something which will help towards that end, because ultimately that, I think, has got to be where the focus is on. So thank you for your attendance today. I think it's the start of a process rather than an event in itself, but we do appreciate your time and your attention and your candour.
Thank you for your time.
Proceedings are finished. Order.